A few weeks ago, we did a call out asking for women of color to share experiences with gender-based violence for a global news series on Canada's ongoing inability to end violence against women. We received dozens of responses. And it's really no surprise because in Canada, half of all women from the age of 16 will experience physical or sexual abuse at least once. This is according to the Canadian Women's Foundation. Every woman is at risk, regardless of their age, their race, or their income level. And yet we know that for some groups of women, that the risk is even greater. On this episode of Living in Color, we're going to take a look at the violence against racialized women and explore how cultural barriers and community stigma play a role along with racial stereotypes and how they can normalize abusive behavior in some cases. Joining me now are 7 survivors who wanted to share their story with us today. Ladies, thank you so much for being here and for being part of this conversation. And again, if there's anything that you don't want to share or that you find is re-traumatizing, please, we can stop this discussion at any time, and we want you to feel comfortable. But I want to start off by telling you why we're doing this series, and it's to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the 30 years since the Montreal Massacre. Do you think in the past 3 decades anything has changed? Are we talking about this more? What have you noticed? Yami, I'll start with you.
I think that we have been talking about it in ebbs and flows. So in 1989, we have the Montreal Massacre. We have over a dozen women that are killed because they are women. We have the surgence of Anita Hill in the early 90s, and then we have the Me Too movement, just a couple of years ago. And so I think when we think of conversations around gender-based violence, specifically around cisgendered women, that it is something that comes in ebbs and flows. And we ask that question, is it new? Mm-hmm. But no, it's not new. It's just, is it going to be the flavor of the month, quite frankly?
What about in racialized communities? Is this something that, was kind of hidden before, but now we're addressing more?
It definitely has come more to light in, I think, recently. For me, I was sexually assaulted in 2015, and it wasn't something that I wanted to tell my family right away. It's something that I kind of needed to figure out on my own and kind of ground myself in my truth so that when I did tell my family eventually, they wouldn't be able to shame me or to kind of say well, you were to blame for it. Why did you get into the car with this person? And even within my own family, my cousin Grace just published her own memoir about how our grandfather molested her for years. And that was a huge family secret that had been hidden in our family. We're Filipino. And it's still kind of like a topic of shame. There was kind of a backlash in our older generations against her specifically. And because of her speaking out now, because it's so public, a few other of my cousins have kind of come forward and said, hey, this happened to me too. That's what our grandfather did. So it's been great in that my generation and our family has been kind of rallying themselves around her and protecting her after this and standing with her.
Renelle, you work in the space of human trafficking. You're a survivor yourself. Has that conversation changed?
I've seen a dramatic change within, I think, the discussion on human trafficking, specifically with sex trafficking. And I think the Me Too movement has been vital for that. Just with conversations about R. Kelly, Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, this topic of sex trafficking has been in the news, and I feel more people are coming out, more people are talking about this, and there's more survivors. However, within spaces of women of color, I don't see that conversation as much. So I know for myself, when I started sharing my story, and that was last year, I sort of looked at the landscape to see who else in Canada is a survivor of sex trafficking that's a Black woman, and I didn't find anybody. So I had to go to the States or places like Africa or Europe to find other Black women who were survivors who were publicly sharing their stories.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's an added shame and stigma with Black women to talk about something about being a survivor of sex trafficking. Because even if you are believed, I think there's always that thought of, are people going to care? Is there going to be empathy for me if I share my story? Or is it just, she was asking for it, or that was her choice. She could have left any time.
Yeah. Jenny, you're nodding your head as well. Talk to me about your story and specifically how cultural stigma and barriers played a part in it.
I think with response barriers, there's many barriers that women of color and women in general go through when they're experiencing sexual violence and looking to report that or go forward and speak about those experiences, including not having any trust or not having any belief in the system, that the system has your back and that you will be supported in your disclosure, including like not having the language to speak about sexual violence within your own community. I think sometimes we grow up not knowing what words to describe what's happening to you, right? I didn't know what was happening to me as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and incest for a very long time. And on top of that, there was so much taboo and stigma associated with going through sexual violence. So when I was able to finally disclose, it was not in my own tongue. It was not to my own community in a way that they would understand.
So you're saying the words didn't exist? Like you were never taught kind of the words?
The words, I'm sure, do exist, but they're just not spoken about because they're so hidden and stigmatized.
You're not in your head. Talk to me about your thoughts on this.
My father is a pastor, so you can understand the responsibility that comes with being a pastor's child. There are many things you don't talk about. And even though I'm very vocal in my family, there are things that I still have to tone down. So when I was going through abuse, that environment to really talk about it wasn't there. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, my father prays for every other person to have wonderful marriages, and somehow my marriage is not totally wonderful. And so those cultural barriers are there. And then there's something that I've come to realize. I realize that while we talk about the culture of silence, we don't also talk about the culture of acceptance. It's almost as if we expect Black women, brown women, to accept violence, where we're taught, to keep quiet. Many Black women, many brown women who go through abuse blame themselves first for the abuse they went through, even when they know that it was not their fault. Mm-hmm. Even the perpetrators would blame you for it. You made me hit you. Mm-hmm. Come on. You could have other responses than hitting me,
I guess, Arzu, how is that different for racialized women, would you say?
I think talking and working with Muslim survivors, and especially young racialized Muslim women, a lot of the stigma comes from patriarchal religious ideas that we've been taught from when we were young. But I think a lot of it also comes from external Islamophobia that we see perpetuated in Canadian politics on a daily basis, right? And it's the mainstream society doesn't really empower and humanize Muslim women enough to give them the bodily autonomy and the agency to even talk about these issues, right? Because you are either victimized and have your personal autonomy taken away by way of restricting how you dress and judging how you dress and how you show up to the world, to spaces within the world. And then there's also that added layer of then you within communities being expected to stay silent and build our men up and have, and create a good front for the community and for the religion somehow.
Serena, when you came out with your story, how do you think stigma played a role in that?
It definitely affected my whole situation in the sense that I did feel pressured to stay silent because it wasn't something that is talked about in my community, and still 4 years later, I almost feel like I am dealing with the backlash and just the hatred from the community for being public about what I went through, because it wasn't something that people wanted to accept, even though they knew it was happening. Obviously, not just with me, but so many women from my community came forward to me after I shared my story saying that I thought I was the only one. I can't believe that you're going through it too, or you went through it too. I would have never guessed. And I was shocked to see really just how common it was within my Ismaili Muslim community. And not just from women, from men too, but the fact that I shared my story at 19 years old, such a young age, and that people 30, 40 were opening up to me about what they had gone through in their marriages and their relationships, it was overwhelming to see just how silenced they all were by this.
There are some people who might be watching, and you've probably heard this from some people that say, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you get yourself out of this situation? Rosalind, talk to me about victim blaming.
In the aftermath of violence, you're just kind of like, why did I do this? Why did I get in the car with this person? Why didn't I say no? I said no. And I still got that victim blaming of, you know, why did you say yes in the first place? Why did you get in the car? Why was it with a coworker? It just reinforces this idea that you're not a human worthy of your autonomy or your safety. It makes you like want to go back in time and go, don't do this, don't get in the car.
To sort of piggyback off your point, I think when people say to somebody, why didn't you leave or why didn't you run away or something like that, it almost makes you complicit in your own abuse.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, they're not able to really understand, I think, a lot of times the psychological and emotional piece, specifically when it comes to, I'm talking about sex trafficking, where traffickers will actually create relationships with their victims where they believe that they're in love. They believe that this is their boyfriend. And so when you have a bond with somebody, it's not just easy to run away. If that's maybe perhaps the only person that's treated you well or acted like they actually cared about you or showed you some sort of love or affection.
I think the cycle of abuse is something that a lot of people don't understand unless they have experienced it or gone through it. It's difficult to really see, well, why is this person staying? Why don't they just leave? Whereas when you're in it, you don't know if things will get worse when you leave. You don't know if that person will come find you or do something to you or your family if they've made threats, which is very, very common.
You know, I was speaking to a crisis counselor recently and I said, is there something common that you hear from women who are in relationships? And she said, the one thing I always hear is, but he loved me. But I thought he loved me was always, always the thing. Blessing, do you agree with that? Do you think
yes. Victim blaming or shaming is something that nobody wants to go through. Believe me, the person wearing the shoes already blames themselves. And so when you blame them or blame us, you're opening us up to re-traumatization. And I follow someone on Twitter who said, a survivor doesn't owe you a convincing story. I think that many people want people's experiences to fit a particular box, to be convincing enough to, to make themselves, okay, yeah, I'm the victim, but it doesn't work that way.
And how does that play into a context when you talk about child abuse?
For me, my boundary, my body autonomy, it was violated against at a very young age by someone that was supposed to protect me, my father. And so living my life as if, oh, but this is normal. This is something that happens to every child. And going through life like that and not understanding that this is trauma, this is sexual abuse, this is not supposed to happen. It's just not any way any child should have to go through, or any adult or any adolescent.
I'd like to add to what she said. When children go through abuse, the first thing you should do is believe the child. Yeah. Abuse is not something children just sit down and just decide to say, oh, he touched me. The moment you do not believe the child, that's it. The child will not open up. And once the child is not opening up, you cannot help the child. And most children that go through abuse now grow up with unresolved trauma, which starts playing up as adults.
I think it's also important for us to interrogate the forms of violence and the forms of violence that are recognized and seen as worthy of a response, even within support systems, right? In the media, for example, who is the perfect victim? Right, the perfect victim. Even a lot of times in conversations around human trafficking, we see white suburban areas that are a lot of times the focus of some of these conversations and campaigns targeting these sorts of crimes. But we know that Black and Indigenous women experience human trafficking in disproportionate amounts, right? Within workplace or within politics, we know that 18-year-old young women are always called exotic because of their eyes or the color of their skin by men 4 times their age. But when a minister, a white woman, gets called climate Barbie, that's when the Twitter response and the media response comes in, right? So even in terms of that harassment, who is seen as worthy of our protection and belief, right? Even within feminist movements and women's spaces, I think that's something that a lot of people aren't ready to target and to talk about.
For a decade, when we would go through the Criminal Injuries and Compensation Board, I would find that survivors would get more validation from that than the criminal justice system. And on top of that, like
putting your hand up,
right? Like, and it's so interesting to me. And people would often critique and be like, well, why add a financial amount to it? I'm like, there's a financial cost not going to work. Yeah.
I mean, I was the same way. Like, the criminal justice system completely failed me. So my rapist ended up being charged with 1 count of sexual assault. He's white. He wasn't born here, and he has an accent, but you know, he still moves through the system. He still moves through our society as a white person. When I met with my Crown prosecutor, she sat down with me and was like, you know, we don't think that there's an actual chance that he's going to be convicted. We were in a Scarborough courthouse, and she was a white woman, and she was like, you know, he's a first-time offender, and he, you know, doesn't look like everybody that walks through this courthouse. And I'm like,
she said that.
She said that to me. He doesn't look like everybody that walks through this courthouse.
Culture of acceptance.
Exactly. And so the charge was withdrawn, and he had to go, like, on the condition that he complete a course on STIs when I wanted him to learn about consent. But then I went through the Criminal Injuries Board, and he tried to testify against me using all these rape myths to try to discredit me, and they still believed me. They were like, you know, we award you this compensation because we do believe that you were a victim of a crime perpetrated by this person. So to have that financial support, it really made a difference. It was really validating to say that, hey, we know that, you know, we can't erase this harm that's been done to you, but at least in the future, you can have this validation, this freedom to live your life the way that you want it to.
Does anybody want to talk about the cost of? Yeah.
Well, I just want to touch on what you said, that you're right, and it's so unfortunate to hear your story and think that you're one of the lucky ones that ended up even getting to even think of it that way. It's horrible. It's horrible that so many people can't even get to that point of being told that their story matters. I know with my experience with the criminal justice system and the police, I had to fight for them to even recognize that I wasn't lying. The first question they asked when they saw me the night that I had called the police was, "Are you sure he did this?"
Who else did it?
And
that's like the question.
It's so degrading, and it makes you second guess yourself almost, like, if you're not going to help me, who is?
And the person in front of you shouldn't feel offended that you want to speak with someone who looks like you. Because at that moment, when you speak with someone who looks like you, or when someone who looks like you walks you through your experience, the vibe is usually different. You can feel the empathy.
I struggle with that one. I really do, because I think that I've had Black counselors, and I think it's a privilege to be in Toronto to have that, because in urban and rural spaces, we don't necessarily see that diversity. But also, like, I am not straight. And so just because you are Black doesn't mean that you're going to understand my lived experience as a queer woman. And I know that, you know, that also varies around gender identity and gender expression if it's a trans woman. So I think that it's important that there is a cultural competence, but that we are not naive in understanding that it's just about our skin color, but understanding that we really need to take an anti-oppressive approach, which looks at gender. And I think also just, you know, one thing I want to say is that we're talking about these experiences as when folks know, like, I did not know. It wasn't like oh, I'm experiencing abuse right now. And I think that that's sometimes a problem that we run into, that we don't recognize how normalized it is, that sometimes we even question ourselves, was that really bad? Was it? And it wasn't until years later that I was like, holy frigging
it.
crap. I went through that. And I was working in a women's organization that dealt with sexual and gender-based violence. I think it's important to contextualize because I think there's always this narrative. It happens, you call the police, something, you know, but it's not linear like that at all.
Ladies, thank you so much for sharing your story with us and for being part of this very important, very timely conversation. And thank you for watching this episode of Living in Color. If you or someone you know is in need of help, there are resources available, including the number on our screen. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for watching Living in Color. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have an idea for a future Living in Color episode, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave them in the comment section.